The sleet on the Boston glass felt personal that afternoon. By the time my mother announced that my $4,000 had accidentally turned into my little sister's first-class ticket to Italy, something inside me did not crack. It went silent. By midnight, I was no longer planning how to get to my sister's wedding on Lake Como. I was planning how to disappear so completely my family would only recognize me when I was signing their paychecks or buying their memories out from under them. Lena Morgan, 29 years old, and running on 3 hours of fitful sleep, watched the January sleet hammer the 35th floor window of Heliostream Freight. The glass was an icy, shuddering membrane, holding back a Boston winter that felt less like weather and more like judgment. My desk was a fortress of organized chaos, the only island of efficiency in this brightly lit, low-grade apocalypse. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead exposed the cheap, peeling veneer of the cubicle walls and the dust motes dancing in the stale air. A networked printer across the aisle choked and spit out a mangled sheet of paper, a sound my colleagues barely registered. It was a Tuesday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was the single human being in the entire Northeast Regional Office who was actually earning my paycheck, and frankly, everyone else's too. For the last 72 hours, I had been submerged in a supply chain crisis involving a container ship stuck somewhere off the coast of New Jersey and $10 million worth of custom Italian leather goods destined for a major client. My supervisor, a perpetually red-faced man named Greg, was ostensibly managing the fallout, which mostly meant forwarding my expertly crafted mitigation emails to his boss and taking credit for phrases I invented, like staged multimodal recovery protocol. The phone sitting on the edge of my desk buzzed, interrupting my concentration as I was drafting a legal disclaimer. The screen simply read, "Mom." A small, automatic softening occurred in my jaw. It was a muscle memory response, the reflex of a daughter trying to be available, trying to be the good one, despite everything. Just this morning, I had transferred my entire quarterly bonus, a clean $4,000, to my mother, Carol Morgan. That money was specifically earmarked to cover the last of the family's flight costs, my own, and the remainder needed for my father, Patrick, to fly to Lake Como for my older sister Sophia's wedding in 2 weeks. It was the final financial hurdle before we all stood on Italian soil, pretending we were a functional, glamorous family. I clicked the screen and put the phone to my ear. The background noise was the familiar tinny music of a department store, Carol's preferred habitat. "Lena, honey, so glad I caught you," she chirped, her voice having that peculiar, bright fuzziness I knew masked either forgetfulness or mischief. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay with the tickets? I saw the 4,000 cleared this morning." I kept my voice low. My attention still split between the crisis email and the conversation. "Oh, the tickets are fine," she said, stretching the word out. "But we had a tiny little wrinkle with the villa accommodation. You know how the groom's family is, all important and established. Well, one of their major investment partners flew in unexpectedly, and they desperately need that small guest wing." A prickle of coldness, unrelated to the weather outside, started at the base of my neck. "The small guest wing is my room, Mom." "Exactly. But don't you worry. Sweetie, I already found you a wonderful alternative. It's a hostel, a boutique hostel, I think they call it, just a few kilometers from the villa. It's got great reviews online, and frankly, I think it'll be good for you. You're still young, you know, and you can mingle with people from all over the world. It's much more adventurous than being stuck with your old parents." I pressed the mute button on my headset for a second, fighting the urge to tell her that I wasn't 22, I was 29, and my idea of adventure did not involve sharing a bathroom with strangers while attending my sister's $1 million wedding. "Mom, that's not the plan. I paid for my accommodation, and I'm supposed to be close to the venue," I stated flatly. A sudden, clumsy cough rattled through the phone line. "Well, that brings me to the other small thing. Darling, about the $4,000. I leaned back in my chair, the emergency email forgotten, my eyes fixed on the gray, blurring sleet. "Yes, The $4,000 for my ticket and the rest of Dad's. Yes, well, Carol chuckled nervously. As I was saying, Tessa's, career, she really needs that visual appeal. Her engagement numbers have been down by almost 20%, and her manager said that the difference between her economy seat and a first-class lie-flat experience is the difference between an amateur trip and a luxury content creation opportunity. She needs the pictures for the gram, Lena. It's for her business, you understand. The words floated in the air, ludicrous and yet completely expected. You used my $4,000 to upgrade Tessa's seat, I heard myself say, the tone surgical, devoid of heat. Yes, and I got a fantastic deal. Only about $4,200 in total for the upgrade and the champagne service. Tessa looks absolutely gorgeous in the seating preview photos. You should see them. And don't worry about your flight. You'll find something cheap. You always do. You're a wizard with those budget airlines. I didn't argue. I didn't even breathe deeply. Instead, I pulled up my personal email and logged into the shared family inbox, the one I had created and maintained since I was in college, using my technical skills to make sure all bills, travel confirmations, and legal documents were organized and backed up. I scrolled down. There it was, the final, undeniable, pixelated proof of my utility. A brightly branded email from the airline. Congratulations, Tessa Morgan. Your upgrade to first class has been confirmed. The details showed a lie-flat pod, complimentary pajamas, and a list of premium champagnes I had just financed. All $4,000 of my bonus, earned over a quarter of working 60-hour weeks in this freezing, miserable office, had been transmuted into a floating bed and expensive bubbles for the golden child, the 22-year-old who considered folding laundry a monumental chore, who had never clocked 40 hours of honest labor in her life. Lena, are you still there? Say something, honey. Carol's voice was getting strained, sensing the silence was not passive agreement. I closed my eyes for one beat. 10 years. I flashed through 10 years of the Morgan family dynamic. The IT support I provided at 3 o'clock in the morning when my father's laptop crashed. The countless hours I spent doing the family tax returns because your math is better, dear. The time I drove my sister's dog 500 miles round trip because she just couldn't manage it with her social calendar. I was the silent, necessary infrastructure. I was the server room. And always, always came the mantra, the toxic balm that absolved them of any guilt. You always figure it out. Lena, you're not high maintenance like the others. You can handle a hostel, and you'll find a way to get a flight. You always land on your feet. That sentence, it wasn't praise, it was a prison sentence. It was the license they used to burn my money, steal my time, and disregard my comfort. I opened my eyes. The office was quiet. Greg was laughing loudly at something on his phone. The storm raged outside, and I was done. The emotion didn't explode. It calcified. It turned into a bitter, brilliant diamond of realization. I inhaled the stale, office air and spoke, my voice low and perfectly even. You're right. Mom, you are absolutely right. A sigh of relief, audible and deeply irritating, came from the other end. Oh, thank goodness. I knew you'd understand. I will figure it out, I repeated, tasting the words before I delivered the kill shot. I will figure out a flight, and I will figure out my own accommodation, but you need to understand one thing very clearly. I paused, letting the finality sink in. I am going to figure it out, but it's going to be for my life, not yours, not Tessa's, not Sophia's. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the end call button with a steady thumb, and placed the device silently back on the desk. The line went dead. I did not cry. I did not feel rage. I only felt the cold, hard, satisfying click of a door slamming shut inside my own soul. The storm office had just witnessed the quiet birth of my escape. I sat at my kitchen island that night, the screen of my laptop still displaying the cost analysis for Sophia's ill-fated Italian destination wedding logistics, The price difference for a last-minute freight change was almost $9,000, money that Carol would expect me to magically absorb or negotiate away for free. My heart was still thumping, not from adrenaline, but from the cold, hard clarity that had finally settled over me during Carol's hysterical 20-minute phone call. It wasn't just the sheer arrogance of the request. It was the utter certainty in her voice that I would, of course, fix it, that I would sacrifice my sleep, my work, and my sanity without a second thought, because that was simply my job. It wasn't just a request. It was an expectation built on almost 3 decades of emotional and logistical servitude. The Morgan family was, in the eyes of the neighborhood, a golden unit. There was Patrick, my father, a former real estate agent who transitioned into consulting, which meant he spent most of his days golfing and worrying about his portfolio. There was Carol, my mother, the matriarch, a whirlwind of social engagements and demanding perfection, ensuring the Morgan brand was always flawless. Then there were the daughters, neatly segmented into roles. First, there was Sophia, the eldest, the future bride, and the model daughter. Sophia was the one praised for her career moves, all of which required substantial help from Patrick's network. Her perfect children, whose school admissions forms and extracurricular schedules I managed, and her enviable marriage, whose complicated prenuptial agreements I had proofread and organized. Sophia got the spotlight. She was the one who received the lavish gifts and the constant validation. Her job was to look beautiful and achieve success, and the whole family supported the illusion. And then there was Tessa, the youngest, the golden child. Tessa was beautiful, naturally charismatic, and completely, cheerfully incompetent. She was a professional influencer, which meant she spent her days posting glossy, aspirational photos while generating almost zero income and maxing out credit cards. She was never criticized. Her financial failures were always someone else's fault, and her every fleeting ambition was met with indulgent, immediate funding from our parents. And me? I was Lena. I was the operating system. I wasn't invited onto the stage. I worked beneath it. The Morgans didn't celebrate my achievements. They utilized my efficiency. The tapestry of my life was a montage of unacknowledged labor. The nights I spent calculating Patrick's complex, multi-state income taxes to save them an accountant's fee. The weekends I drove to my grandparents' house to reset their Wi-Fi router and set up Carol's new smart home devices. The hours I spent on the phone dealing with bureaucratic nightmares, from utility billing errors to arranging complex, multi-specialty doctor appointments for my cousins. They didn't see me running their lives. They saw themselves as just lucky to have a daughter who was so good with computers and paperwork. Every task was followed by the same dismissive praise. "You always figure it out, Lena." It was a phrase meant to be a compliment, but it served as a brutal boundary. It meant they didn't have to worry, didn't have to thank me, and certainly didn't have to give me any credit. I was the invisible foundation. If I failed, the whole beautifully constructed edifice of their lives would collapse, but they never, ever considered the cost of holding it up. My one true ally in that family was Aunt Renata, Patrick's estranged sister. She was the family oddball, a retired professor who lived modestly and was frequently maligned for her poor life choices, prioritizing travel and intellectual pursuits over wealth accumulation. 3 years ago, on a rare visit to Boston, Renata had pulled me aside in the chaos of a large family Christmas party. "You look exhausted, Lena," she'd said, her eyes sharp and knowing. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew. She'd slipped a small, thin savings book into my hand. It was from a bank I didn't recognize, and it was anonymous, tucked inside a card that simply read, "Happy birthday." "Don't open it now," she'd murmured, her voice low enough to be drowned out by Tessa's loud laughter from across the room. "That is your escape door. It's not a gift for an apartment or a new car. It is a lifeline for when you finally realize you have to burn the whole thing down. It is for when you can't stand being their functionary for one more hour." I had opened it later that night. The balance was $130,000. At the time, I'd been stunned. I remember smiling, thinking Renata was being overdramatic. I was unhappy, yes, but leaving? No. That money sat untouched. An insurance policy I never thought I'd cash. Now, 3 years later, Renata's words felt like a cold, sharp prophecy. The exploitation was relentless, yet small enough in each instance that it was easy to dismiss. I still vividly remembered the year Carol canceled my 30th birthday dinner because it, coincidentally, overlapped with Patrick's favorite football team's first home game. I remembered the month Tessa borrowed my secondary credit card for an emergency wardrobe purchase and never paid back the $3,000, forcing me to shift around my own finances. But the real weight, the invisible shackle that defined my relationship with them, was an event they knew nothing about. It happened 4 years ago. Tessa, driving home from a party, had been drinking and totaled a vintage Porsche parked on the street. The car belonged to a powerful Boston developer who was not interested in settling quietly. The police report mentioned a high blood alcohol content and potential felony charges related to property damage and driving under the influence. Tessa had called me in a panic, crying about how Mom and Dad would kill me. In that moment of deep-seated conditioning, I had switched from sister to operator. I didn't hesitate. I spent the next 6 weeks in a subterranean panic, working with a specialist traffic lawyer who charged $28,000, an astronomical fee, to negotiate the charges down, broker a confidential settlement with the developer, and erase all trace of the incident before my parents even got wind of the police report. I used almost all of my existing savings. I lied to my parents, telling them I had invested the money. I saved Tessa from a devastating criminal record, not because she deserved it, but because I was terrified of the fallout that would rock the rest of the family. She had thanked me, hugged me, and then immediately went back to ignoring my texts for weeks, secure in the knowledge that Lena had absorbed the debt and the danger. It was in the aftermath of that hidden disaster that the pattern became undeniable, a cruel inverse logic. Every time I saved one of them, every time I took on a crisis and neutralized it, they owed me less, not more. They didn't feel gratitude. They felt entitlement. I had normalized the impossible, making my exhaustion and my sacrifice part of the background noise of their charmed lives. The feeling that settled over me now, looking at the demands for Sophia's Italian freight, wasn't sadness or anger. It was a cold, hard finality. I wasn't their good daughter. I was their free, highly efficient, unacknowledged service provider. And this particular contract, my life, was past its expiration date. I walked into my bedroom, pulled a small, locked metal box from the back of my closet, and retrieved the thin savings book. I ran my thumb over the balance. $130,000. It was more than enough to start over. It was more than enough to vanish. I looked at the number, then out the window at the distant glow of the city where my family believed I was tethered forever. I finally whispered the words that would change everything. Aunt Renata, I think I really have reached the point where I have to use your escape door. I didn't waste time on righteous anger. Anger was sloppy. And in my family's world, anger meant you lost control, giving them permission to dismiss you as emotional. What they had just done, turning my $4,000 into Tessa's first-class fantasy, was a clean, technical betrayal. My response had to be just as clean. My desk chair was already spinning to the humming color printer. I located the email confirming Tessa's first-class upgrade, complete with seat diagrams and the full dollar amount charged. I printed it out, crisp on heavy stock paper. Beside it, I printed the transfer confirmation from my bank showing the initial $4,000 deposit sent to Carol's account hours before. These two pieces of paper, clipped together, were the perfect audit trail, the subtle and irrefutable evidence of the transaction that ended my loyalty. I didn't send an email. Email was too long, too open to analysis. I found the number on my cell phone, the one I would discard in 48 hours, and sent a text to my mother. It contained 6 words and was my final communication. I will handle myself from now on. I put the phone on silent and turned my back on the crisis at Heliostream Freight. The real work had just begun. That evening, I did not open the familiar travel websites where I usually hunted for budget tickets to Europe. Instead, I booted up my personal laptop and created a new spreadsheet in a protected folder labeled Project Self-Acquisition. The first tab was called The Escape Blueprint. This wasn't a budget, it was a detonation plan. I started by listing every asset and liability, not just financially, but in terms of contact points. My car, a reliable, 2-year-old sedan, estimated sell price, $21,000. My apartment lease, 2 months remaining. Penalty for early termination, $2,000. Furniture. Quick sale on Marketplace would yield maybe $1,500. The costs were precise, the liquidation rapid. Next, I severed the electronic tethers. I withdrew every penny, a little over $2,300, from the obscure checking accounts that Carol and Patrick were unaware of. These were small pools of money I used for frivolous purchases or emergency repairs, money they had no right to know about. Then, I closed the joint savings account they had convinced me to co-sign on years ago, claiming it was better for their credit rating. That account was clean. I had made sure of that, never depositing my own money, but the possibility of them using my signature to gain access to future accounts needed to be permanently eliminated. The largest and most important move required a trip downtown. I pulled Aunt Renata's bank book, the one containing the $130,000 that had been silently collecting interest for 3 years. It felt heavy in my hand, less like cash and more like stored potential energy. I walked into a major bank that had 0 U.S. retail branches, one that specialized in international corporate transfers. Over the course of 3 nerve-wracking hours, I opened an anonymous limited liability company, an LLC, and established an offshore bank account in the company's name. By the time I left, the $130,000 was fully digitized, encrypted, and residing outside the immediate reach of any U.S.-based creditors, or, crucially, any inquiring family members. That money was now a ghost, an entirely new foundation built on silence. The next phase was strategic. I pulled up my employment contract with Heliostream Freight. My non-compete clause was dense, boilerplate language that Damian Cole, my arrogant senior VP, relied on to intimidate departing employees. I skimmed through the legal jargon and highlighted the geographical scope. It explicitly covered North America and the entirety of the European Union. It was a vast area, but the world was larger. I pulled up a world map, minimizing the areas that were legal black zones for me. South America bloomed on the screen: raw materials, growing consumer markets, and complex logistics problems that demanded competence. Exactly the kind of place where an operator like me could not only survive but thrive. I cross-referenced trade agreements, local manufacturing strength, and political stability. I needed a country with a substantial export-driven industry that wasn't already saturated by American freight giants. My finger hovered over the Pacific coast, Lima, Peru, rich in history, a massive textile and high-quality leather goods industry, and a complex system of internal logistics that was ripe for disruption by someone who understood U.S. supply chain demands. It was far enough south to make a casual family visit impossible, and it was a language I was prepared to learn. While the international transfer was processing, I wrote one final document: the Emergency Contact Protocol. I set up a specialized email account, one the family would never trace, and scheduled a series of automated emails to send to Carol and Patrick every 30 days for the next year. The subject line would be brief: Update, I am safe. The body was just one line: Do not report me missing. I am safe, I am working, and I will not be responding to any inquiries. I will contact you when I choose. This was critical. If they reported me missing, the police would investigate, find my empty apartment, and potentially involve my employer, or even freeze my accounts, delaying my escape. By preemptively stating I was voluntarily choosing no contact, I established a legal precedent that kept the authorities out of my affairs. It wasn't kindness. It was a calculated legal buffer zone. Everything was in place. The spreadsheet was balanced. The money was secured. The legal threats were mitigated. I opened my web browser one last time. A pop-up ad for cheap flights to Milan for Sophia's wedding seemed to mock me. I stared at the price. The $300 it would cost to get to the city where I would sleep in a hostel and watch my sister drink champagne I paid for. I closed the tab. I opened a new search and typed, "One-way flight Lima, Peru." The result was a ticket for 2 days from now. Departing Boston Logan. I navigated to the payment portal, entered the details of my new, anonymous International LLC card, and clicked the confirmation button. The sound of the transaction going through wasn't a chime, it was a muffled thud. My $4,000 bought Tessa champagne in the sky. My $130,000 bought me a new life, a clean break, and the perfect, necessary silence. The morning after I booked my flight to Lima, the cold snap had broken, leaving the Boston streets glazed in a treacherous, glittering ice. I arrived at Heliostream Freight early, carrying only a small briefcase, inside which lay my meticulously typed, 2-sentence letter of immediate resignation. I walked straight past my supervisor, Greg, whose desk was still dark. I bypassed the humming cubicles and headed for the corner office of Damien Cole, the senior vice president of our entire logistical network, the man who excelled at taking credit and delegating incompetence. Damien was already on a call, pacing his enormous office with the kind of performative intensity only people who contribute nothing truly possess. He was loudly recounting the supply chain crisis I had stayed up until 3 a.m. fixing. "Yes, Bob, we implemented a brilliant multimodal protocol," he boomed into his headset, smoothing the lapel of his expensive, custom-tailored suit. "Took the bull by the horns. Minimal client disruption. That's just how we operate here at Heliostream." He glanced up, saw me standing in the doorway, and offered a dismissive wave, signaling me to wait. I didn't move. I waited until he hung up, radiating a patient inertia that was itself a challenge. Damien finally lowered his phone, annoyed. "What is it, Morgan? Can't you see I was handling major client relations?" I stepped forward, placed the sealed manila envelope on the polished mahogany of his desk, a surface where no actual work was ever performed, and simply said, "My resignation, effective immediately." He didn't touch the envelope for a beat, his expression shifting from irritation to contempt. "Oh, please, what is this? Lena? Did you get a bad performance review? Don't be dramatic. Go back to your Excel sheets." He finally picked it up, tearing the seal with a flourish. As he scanned the brief contents, his face went from dismissive to crimson. I watched the muscle tick near his temple start to pulse. "Are you serious? You can't do this. We're short-handed, and this is completely unprofessional. Morgan, you know that." He tossed the letter back down. "What did they offer you? A $50,000 bump at some regional competitor? A lateral move to Europe? Is that it?" He leaned forward, dropping the patronizing air for a genuine, reptilian threat. "Let me remind you of something. Lena, that non-compete clause you signed is ironclad. If you think you can jump ship to any freight or logistics firm in the States or the European Union in the next 12 months, I will personally see to it that you are buried under so many legal bills your career will be nothing but debt. I will ruin you." Damien settled back, satisfied. This was his move, the one he had used to keep every talented, underpaid analyst chained to his desk for fear of litigation. He looked certain he had won. I met his gaze, my hands folded neatly in front of me, steady as granite. "I appreciate your concern for my career longevity, Damien," I said, my voice measured and calm. "But your professional worldview is a little too narrow. You seem to believe the logistical network ends where your expensive wine tours begin." He frowned. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means that I'm going to a place that falls entirely outside the geographical constraints of your non-compete agreement," I stated. "The world is larger than North America and the EU. Damien, far, far larger. And I'm going to a city whose name you probably can't even pronounce correctly." He stared at me, then barked out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, come on! Is this some kind of ridiculous power play? You're going to run off to, what, the desert? The Philippines? You're bluffing. Morgan, you're too risk-averse. You'll be back begging for your job in 2 weeks. Have a good life, Damien, I finished. The dismissal quiet, but absolute. I walked back to my cubicle and started the final act of severance. I emptied my desk in 2 swift minutes. The small jade plant I had nurtured for 3 years went into the recycling bin. I wasn't moving plants. My favorite ceramic coffee mug, chipped from years of rushed mornings, joined it. The last thing was a framed picture of my college graduation. I didn't smash it, but I carefully turned the photo face down on the desktop and walked away, leaving the shadow of the frame behind. That was the last physical trace of the old Lena Morgan at Heliostream Freight. The next 48 hours were a blur of transaction and subtraction. Time was the only non-renewable resource I was spending. I drove my sedan to a national chain dealership that offered instant cash for used cars. They gave me $21,000, a good 7% below market value, but speed was worth the financial sacrifice. I walked out carrying a thick wad of bills and an empty driver's seat. I logged onto the local marketplace app and sold the bulk of my furniture, the sectional sofa, the dining set, the bookshelf, for pennies, demanding cash and immediate pickup. I told everyone I was moving out of state and needed to be rid of everything. The landlord was less accommodating, but I handed the super a cash envelope containing $2,000, the early termination penalty plus an extra $500 for his trouble, and simply walked away from the lease, avoiding the paper trail of a final rent check. The last step was the most symbolic. I bought a cheap, anonymous prepaid phone from a bodega. I transferred the few contacts I genuinely valued, 2 college friends, Aunt Renata's number, and the details for the customs broker I had found in Lima, to the new device. Then, I took my old, beloved smartphone. I popped out the SIM card that contained a decade of texts, calls, and family emergencies. I drove to a deserted gas station on the outskirts of the city, stepped into the fluorescent light of the trash receptacle area, and with a focused snap, I broke the SIM card in half. I dropped the 2 pieces, along with the burner phone's original packaging, into the bin. The phone itself I factory reset and dropped in a separate recycling bin miles away. I was untraceable. I was nobody. That night, 48 hours after Carol's phone call, I stood in the departure line at Logan Airport. I wasn't carrying a light carry-on suitcase for a fun 2-week Italian vacation. I had 2 heavy, black, functional suitcases packed with only necessities, professional clothes, and a set of local phrase books. I presented my one-way ticket to Lima, Peru, and watched the gate agent nod without question. The anonymity was glorious. As the plane lifted off, climbing through the cold, inky northeastern sky, I looked down at the grid of city lights shrinking beneath me. Somewhere down there, my parents and sisters were probably still assuming I was wrestling with an online travel agency, hunting for the cheapest last-minute ticket to Milan, convinced I would show up at Lake Como, slightly harassed, but ultimately compliant, just in time for the ceremony. They were waiting for their unpaid IT support to land. They would be waiting a long, long time. The first 6 months in Peru were a brutal education. They were nothing like the sanitized world of Boston corporate logistics. I spent Aunt Renata's $130,000, my escape fund, not on lavish living, but on endless buses, dusty backroads, and cheap inns near the weaving communities tucked into the Andean highlands. My days were a cycle of imperfect Spanish, bargaining for the cost of alpaca fiber, and learning the difference between a high-quality baby alpaca wool and a cheap acrylic blend. I was no longer the chief operator of the Morgan family. I was an independent sourcing agent running on adrenaline and bitter coffee. The money went to opening small, direct contracts with artisan families, a family in Huancayo making scarves, another in Ayacucho specializing in dyed leather bags, a collective of women who wove tapestry throws by hand. There was no big system, only trust built on prompt cash payments and my unfailing attention to detail. I opened email channels to a handful of high-end boutiques in New York and coastal California, sending samples via express courier, meticulously documenting the thread counts and dye batches. I was slow, I was small, but I was precise. I became the quiet American girl who always delivers on time and always pays the agreed price. I was building a tiny, legitimate empire, one perfectly finished stitch at a time, but the cost was measured in physical exhaustion. In the middle of my 7th month, after a particularly grueling 3-day trek to secure a new supply of fine vicuna wool high in the mountains, my body gave out. The combination of the thin air, the constant stress, and something the local doctor later vaguely called a bad fever, likely a vicious viral infection, threw me onto a rickety twin bed in a small, windowless hostel room. The walls were thin plaster, and the only sound was the incessant drumming of rain on the corrugated metal roof. I shivered violently beneath every blanket the room possessed, my body shaking with a fever that felt like a furnace stoked by every suppressed emotion of the last decade. My head pounded with the rhythmic force of a small, forgotten drum. In the small, terrifying moments of lucidity between bouts of delirium, my hand automatically reached for the prepaid phone. The screen flickered to life, the brightness searing my eyes. My thumb hovered over a contact labeled simply, Mom. In that moment, reduced to a shell of sweating, aching bone, the old Lena Morgan, the dependent one, whispered a desperate plea. I imagined the scenario, a terrified phone call, Carol's panicked but ultimately efficient mobilization of resources, Patrick using his business connections, and Sophia maybe even posting an Instagram story about her poor lost sister. They would jet down, take me to a sterile hospital, pay the bills, and bring me home. My finger paused, resting on the hard plastic of the screen. And then? I heard Carol's voice, sharp and clear despite the fever. You always figure it out. Lena. I saw the cold calculation in her eyes. The rescue would not be about my well-being. It would be about restoring the system. They would bring me home, nurse me back to health, and then demand 48 hours of my time to reorganize their tax documents, find their misplaced passwords, and update their insurance policies, a down payment on my life, securing my return to servitude. Every comfort, every glass of water, every single word of worry would come with the silent, terrible demand that I become their functionary again. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. Rosa, the owner of the hostel, a woman I had exchanged maybe 20 total Spanish phrases with, stood by the bed. She was older, wearing a thick woven shawl, her face lined by a life lived under the high Andean sun. She wasn't looking at me with pity or judgment, just a quiet concern. She had somehow noticed the silence and the lack of movement from my room. She sat on the edge of the bed, placing a bowl of warm, steaming rice broth on the nightstand. She pressed a cool, damp cloth to my forehead and gently began to fan the air above my face with a folded newspaper. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She simply gave me medicine, nourishment, and a silent, unhurried presence. She stayed until I drifted back into a fitful, shallow sleep. In the fevered haze of the next 3 days, the essential division of my life became blindingly clear. My family, bound by blood and decades of shared history, had never, in all my 29 years, provided me with that simple, wordless, unconditional care. They had never once seen me as Lena, the vulnerable person, only as Lena, the useful tool. Yet, a total stranger, speaking a different language in a thin-walled room thousands of miles from my home, had provided it freely and immediately. I kept the phone clutched in my hand, but I didn't press the call button. I let my hand drop, the phone bouncing softly on the mattress. The desperate, 29-year-old girl who still secretly craved their approval, who still believed that if she just collapsed hard enough, they would finally see her value, was suffocating. I let her suffocate. I let the addiction to being accepted and loved by the Morgans die alongside the burning heat of the viral fever. When the fever finally broke, the exhaustion was profound. I was weak, shaky, and bruised by the ordeal. But psychologically, I was harder than concrete. The vulnerable, needy part of me had been purged. I dragged myself out of bed, stumbled to the window, and opened it. The cold, fresh mountain air rushed in, clean and sharp, filling my lungs. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked down at the valley where my future awaited, and the resolution solidified into steel. From this day forward, everything I built, every contract, every dollar, every success, was going to be named only after me, protected only by me. I was not a utility. I was a force, and no one, absolutely no one, would ever get to feed off my strength for free again. The 3-day fever had incinerated the last vestiges of my need for approval. When I was finally strong enough to stand, I didn't waste a single hour mourning the person I used to be. The only thing that mattered was the $130,000 Aunt Renata had given me, and the fact that I was now operating with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. I began investing that seed capital, that life raft, strategically. I negotiated exclusive, small-batch contracts with the artisan families I had identified. This wasn't just about moving product, it was about building trust. While other, larger buyers tried to squeeze the artisans for every cent, I offered fair prices and, crucially, paid consistently and immediately upon delivery. My philosophy was simple. Reliability is a currency more valuable than short-term cost savings. My new operational challenges were entirely organic, forcing me to rely on true ground-level competence rather than Heliostream's antiquated enterprise software. I learned to read the sky as a logistics planner, predicting when the torrential rainy season would wash out key truck routes through the high mountain passes and scheduling shipments around them. I found out, through persistence and a willingness to sit in dusty offices, who the trustworthy independent freight brokers were, the ones who treated a 500-mile trip over a narrow, winding road with the seriousness it deserved, and who were the fly-by-night operators who would forget a shipment in a warehouse for a week. In the small, interconnected world of Peruvian textile and leather exports, word of my operations spread fast. I was referred to as the quiet American woman with the cold eyes. The quiet American with the cold eyes, who paid exactly what she promised, demanded exacting quality, and never, ever missed a delivery window. I ran my supply chain with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, even though my system was a series of meticulously organized spreadsheets and a prepaid phone. The success was exponential. Within 9 months, I had established a fully independent vendor chain sourcing scarves, leather goods, hand-woven tapestry rugs, and luxury alpaca jackets. I moved from shipping small boxes of samples to consolidating freight in half-sized containers, utilizing third-party shipping giants to handle the oceanic crossing to the U.S. My client base grew from 3 small California boutiques to 24 independent high-end retailers on the East and West Coasts who valued the authenticity and consistent quality I guaranteed. My anonymous LLC account was a testament to the power of operational excellence. Aunt Renata's $130,000 had first ballooned to $350,000, and by the 1-year anniversary of my flight from Boston, it was sitting comfortably above $400,000. I immediately reinvested a large chunk of it into securing exclusive warehousing space near the port of Callao, and implemented a commercial, satellite-based tracking system, no longer necessary to trust in the vague promises of a truck driver. I knew exactly where my goods were at any hour. The work was relentless, but every dollar earned was clean, uncompromised, and entirely mine. The memory of Tessa's first-class seat became a cold, motivating fuel. Then, just as the Peruvian operation was becoming self-sustaining, the call came, not a phone call, which I still screened ruthlessly, but an email. The subject line was professionally vague, but the sender was not. Marisol Drake, CEO of Aurora Global Transit. Aurora Global Transit was the undisputed global powerhouse, a logistics firm that made Heliostream Freight look like a small-town delivery service. Damien Cole dreamed of meeting someone like Marisol. I had an email from her direct assistant requesting a meeting. The meeting was set for a discreet cafe in Miraflores. Lima, Marisol Drake was everything Damien was not. Sharp, understated, and utterly focused. She didn't bother with small talk. "I'll be direct, Lena," she began, sipping her coffee. "I don't care about your resume. Your official employment history stops at Heliostream Freight a year ago, and your academic background is strong but unremarkable. What interests me is what you've done since." She slid a tablet across the table. It displayed my entire Peruvian operation, laid out in stunning, graphic detail. My vendor network, my estimated gross revenue, my incredibly efficient shipping turnaround times, and the zero error rate on my last 50 exports. They had been watching me, not threatening me, but scouting me. "You took $130,000 and turned it into an almost $500,000 import-export business in a high-risk region, bypassing the usual American supply chain pitfalls. You built this out of nothing but grit, a laptop, and sheer operational competence. You are moving high-value goods reliably through one of the most unpredictable landscapes in South America. That is genius-level logistics," Marisol stated, her eyes locking onto mine. "And that is exactly the kind of black box thinking Aurora needs." She pushed a printed contract across the table. "I'm not offering you a job. I'm offering you a mandate. The position is Director of Regional Strategic Development. You will focus on scaling and replicating your methodology across all of our emerging South American markets." I picked up the document. The numbers made my eyes widen, even my hardened, business-focused eyes. The base salary was over $260,000 per year, with a performance-based bonus structure that could easily triple that figure within the first year. The mandate included a starting budget of $15 million and a dedicated team of 20 people, all reporting directly to me. It was everything I had worked for, amplified 1,000 times. It was an executive position in the global elite, a role that Damian Cole, my former boss, would never even get an interview for. I took 20 minutes to review the contract, asking pointed questions about corporate autonomy and profit-sharing thresholds. Marisol answered every question with the same directness she had started with. I signed the document right there. "Where will I be based?" I asked, once the ink was dry. "You start in the field. Of course, finishing your handover here," Marisol said, smiling thinly. "But your permanent home base will be Chicago or New York. We want you close to the center of power." "New York," I replied without hesitation. I wanted to be closer to Boston, closer to the ghost I was about to manifest. I accepted the job, shook Marisol's hand, and walked out of the cafe. A director at Aurora Global Transit. My family, meanwhile, was still receiving my 30-day automated email. Update: I am safe. They were likely still telling neighbors and friends that Lena was taking a little solo time to find herself, or perhaps, more accurately, being difficult and refusing to call home. In a few weeks, I would be flying back over the U.S., not to sleep in a hostel a few kilometers from their wedding villa, but to occupy a corner office high above the Manhattan skyline, commanding a budget the size of their entire neighborhood. The revenge wasn't just success. It was success achieved in absolute, untraceable silence, allowing me to return as a phantom capable of shifting their entire world without them ever knowing what hit them. 15 months after the one-way flight out of Boston Logan, Lena Morgan stepped off a plane at JFK, a completely different entity. The cheap, functional luggage was replaced by 2 sleek, hard-shelled suitcases. The fear of being traced was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of being impossible to find. My destination was the 40th floor of the Aurora Global Transit headquarters, a shimmering glass monolith in Midtown Manhattan that commanded a brutal, unforgiving view of the city. The office was a study in minimalist power, hushed carpets, panoramic windows, and silent efficiency. I settled into my new domain, Director of Regional Strategic Development, reporting directly to Marisol Drake. My first 3 months were a blur of dismantling Heliostream-style inefficiency. I took my meticulously developed South American network, the same one I had personally built with Aunt Renata's $130,000, and integrated it into Aurora's massive framework. The results were instantaneous and dramatic. within 90 days, by cutting out unnecessary intermediaries and relying on my highly trustworthy direct sourcing lines. I had slashed Aurora's operating costs in the region by almost 20%, simultaneously increasing material throughput. Marisol's response was a rare, all-caps email that landed in my inbox late one Friday night. "You are making me rich, Morgan. Keep it up. Consider your annual bonus tripled." The validation was gratifying, but the real pleasure came from a clipped message sent via LinkedIn by a former colleague at HelioStream, an analyst who had always quietly supported me. Subject, FYI. "Lena, it's Ben. Just wanted to let you know Damien knows. He just lost the Argentinian leather contract and half the Chilean wine logistics to Aurora. He's boiling. He keeps ranting about that traitor Morgan. Stay safe." I deleted the message immediately. The knowledge was all I needed. I hadn't just escaped. I had taken the territory I was supposed to have worked for at HelioStream and delivered it, polished and profitable, to their biggest rival. Damien wasn't just losing business. He was losing face, and for a man like him, that was professional annihilation. Meanwhile, in the sterile, beige world of HelioStream, Damien Cole was indeed boiling. He was now routinely called into vice president meetings to explain why Aurora Global Transit, a company he considered bloated and slow, was suddenly eating their lunch in high-margin emerging markets. He had lost contracts totaling over $15 million in potential revenue, all linked to the same geographical region. He knew it was Lena. She was the only person who understood the complex, undocumented ground logistics necessary to make that region profitable. His obsession turned from business strategy to personal vendetta. He needed proof that Lena had violated her non-compete, that she had stolen intellectual property or clients before she left. But Lena had covered her tracks perfectly. All her work had been built from scratch after her departure. Then, his search for dirt led him, ironically, to the source of Lena's greatest vulnerability, her sister, Tessa Morgan. Damien wasn't a good man, but he was an excellent predator. He found Tessa right where she was always found, on Instagram, posting glossy pictures with deeply anxious captions. Her feed showed her at expensive coffee and influencer retreats, but her private reality, easily inferred from a deeper scroll, hinted at desperation. She was publicly complaining about low engagement, credit card maximums, and the difficulty of keeping up with the influencer hustle. Damien, adopting the persona of a successful, mature mentor, sent Tessa a direct message. DM, "I work in logistics. Tessa, your feed is beautiful. I run a large company, and I think you have incredible potential. Maybe we could meet for coffee? I have some ideas that could boost your brand visibility." Tessa, starving for validation and desperate for a bailout, agreed instantly. They met at a trendy cafe in downtown Boston, the kind of place Lena would never have wasted money on. Damien was charm personified. He praised her looks, her aesthetic eye, and listened patiently as Tessa detailed her financial woes, lamenting how hard it was to make money when you had to pay for your own first-class upgrades now that Lena ran off. Then, Damien expertly shifted the focus. He leaned in, his voice low and confiding, spinning his tale of woe. "I need to tell you the truth. Tessa, I'm being personally ruined by your sister. She violated a contract. She stole proprietary client data from my company, HelioStream. That is a crime. She used it to get that director job at Aurora. I'm not asking you to hurt your sister, but I need proof to bring her to justice. Justice for me, and justice for the good people she hurt." Tessa's eyes glazed over. She had spent the last 15 months telling anyone who would listen that Lena had abandoned her family, leaving her to deal with all the adult stuff, which meant running errands and managing her own debt. Tessa already saw herself as the victim of Lena's desertion. Damien's story perfectly validated her narrative. Lena wasn't successful. She was a criminal who had victimized a poor, honest man like Damien. "What do you need?" Tessa asked, her voice tight with a mixture of resentment and manufactured righteousness. "I need access," Damien whispered. I need the old family emails, the ones from before she left. She used that account to communicate with clients. Just the login. And maybe some of the old expense reports she filed for your parents. We need to find the smoking gun. He slid a thick brown envelope across the table. It wasn't flat. It was stuffed with crisp, new bills. That's $10,000, Damien said softly. A consultation fee. For your time. Just for helping me find justice. Tessa stared at the envelope. $10,000 cash. It was enough to pay off her most immediate credit card debts and fund 2 months of content creation. A small, weak voice in her head, the last echo of sibling loyalty, tried to protest. But what if Lena gets in trouble? Tessa immediately smothered it with justification. Lena is always fine. She always lands on her feet. She's too clever to get caught. This is just about making that awful man whole again. And I need this money. She took the envelope. She typed the password for the shared family email account onto a napkin, along with the location of a few old, archived expense reports Lena had compiled for her family's tax returns. Files Tessa didn't understand, but knew Lena managed. She gave Damien the key to Lena's past. 2 weeks later, the silence in the Aurora Global Transit executive offices was shattered. A thick registered packet arrived addressed to Marisol Drake. Inside was a formal legal complaint from Heliostream Freight. Signed by Damien Cole, the accusation was severe. Lena Morgan, Director of Regional Strategic Development, was charged with theft of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, and systematic client solicitation while still employed by Heliostream. The complaint was backed by a chilling body of evidence, a collection of carefully redacted email threads and internal logs that Damien had fabricated and retroactively inserted into the family email account, all designed to look like Lena had been conducting her private logistics business while still sitting in her old cubicle. My past, which I thought I had perfectly walled off, had just found a key and walked right into my new life. The email landed in my inbox 48 hours after the legal complaint arrived. It was terse, professional, and chilling. A meeting invitation for the following Thursday, titled Review of Personnel Suitability, signed by the head of Aurora's legal department. The note beneath the agenda read, "You are welcome to bring personal counsel." Attached was a thick PDF file containing Damien Cole's entire packet of evidence. I didn't feel dread. I felt the cold, familiar thrill of reviewing a flawed blueprint. I opened the file on my locked laptop. It was a masterpiece of amateur fabrication. There were screenshots of email exchanges between me and my Peruvian contacts from the time I was still at Heliostream. Chat logs showing me downloading massive files of client data, and several PDFs of internal reports. The documents looked authentic, but my analytical mind immediately detected the scent of a lie. I spotted the first flaw instantly. The timestamp on a key download log was off by exactly 5 hours and 23 minutes. That was the time difference between Boston and Lima during daylight saving time, meaning the log had been manually entered by someone in Boston trying to retroactively set a time for South America and failing to account for the conversion properly. Another document's metadata showed a date created that fell 6 months after I had left the country. The most damning evidence had been authored by a generic system account named Admin01, an account I knew only high-level management, or a desperate executive, had access to. I minimized the file. The evidence was not intended to prove guilt. It was intended to coerce a settlement and ruin my reputation. Damien had fundamentally misunderstood my nature. I didn't panic and settle. I found the weakest link in the chain and applied maximum force. My first and only call was to Carmen Reyes, Aurora's head of forensic IT. Carmen was a legend, a former government cyber specialist who spoke in code and audited the cloud infrastructure like it was her own backyard. "Carmen," I said, keeping my voice level, "I have a former employer trying to sue us. They're claiming I stole data. The evidence is fabricated. But I need something irrefutable. I need the full third-party cloud audit trail for their primary file share, going back 18 months. Carmen paused. a dry chuckle crackling over the line. You want the immutable logs from their provider? The ones that are digitally signed every 24 hours and can't be edited even by God? Exactly, I confirmed. Aurora has the legal leverage to demand them under the pretrial discovery agreement. If I'm accused of touching their data, we have the right to inspect the actual vault logs. I'll send you the details. I need to know the exact user ID and IP address that created and uploaded those files, and the exact time it occurred. Carmen was intrigued. Consider it done. Give me 48 hours. 2 days later, I was sitting in the high-security glass conference room on the 48th floor of Aurora Global Transit. The environment was designed to intimidate. 12 high-powered executives, board members, and legal counsel sat around the massive marble table. Marisol Drake, the CEO, sat at the head, radiating an unnerving silence. Damian Cole was there too, invited to present his case. He looked entirely too smug, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and carrying a bespoke leather portfolio. He clearly believed this was merely a procedural formality before my swift and humiliating dismissal. Damian started his presentation with a polished, 30-slide PowerPoint, a monument to corporate slander. He pointed to the magnified images of the email logs, his voice ringing with self-righteous indignation. He painted me as a cold, calculating thief who used my access and family relationships to steal corporate secrets and lure away clients while collecting a paycheck. Ms. Morgan, he concluded, pointing to a graph showing a fictional revenue loss at HelioStream. She committed a clear breach of contract. We demand her immediate termination, a cease and desist on any further South American dealings, and $40 million in damages. The board members looked at me with varying degrees of doubt and judgment. Marisol leaned forward. Ms. Morgan, your response? I opened my laptop. I didn't use a flashy PowerPoint template. My presentation was a single, stark white slide projecting the Aurora logo. I spoke not to Damian, but to Marisol and the board, my voice devoid of emotion, operating purely on logic. I find Mr. Cole's presentation compelling. If fictional, his entire case rests on the integrity of his evidence, and that, I continued, clicking to the next slide, is where he made a critical error. I projected a screenshot of a raw data table, the cloud provider's official audit log. Mr. Cole's exhibits were taken from the HelioStream server. The logs you are now looking at were pulled by our team, legally and forensically, directly from the third-party cloud provider, an entity whose entire business model relies on the fact that these logs cannot be manipulated, changed, or falsified. They are digitally signed at the source. I used a laser pointer to highlight 2 columns. Mr. Cole claims I downloaded this confidential client data on September 4th, a date when I was still employed. The third-party log clearly shows that every single file in his evidence packet was not created or uploaded until February 2nd of the following year, 6 months after I had left the United States entirely. The quiet in the room tightened into a vacuum. I clicked again, isolating a single line on the log. Furthermore, the user ID responsible for creating and uploading these falsified evidence files was not a former employee. It was an account designated Admin01, and the originating IP address, confirmed by our forensic team? I looked directly at Damian, whose face was now a sickly gray. It originated from a network assigned to the office of Mr. Damian Cole, Suite 2006, at HelioStream Freight Headquarters. The door opened, and Carmen Reyes walked in, radiating technical authority. I can confirm the integrity of these logs, Carmen stated, addressing Marisol. The data proves, beyond reasonable doubt, that Mr. Cole fabricated all evidence and inserted it into the HelioStream cloud system months after Miss Morgan's departure, using his administrative access, with the intent to slander and extort this company. The board erupted in muted whispers. A respected member of the audit committee fixed Damian with a lethal stare. Mr. Cole, are you sitting in our boardroom right now, presenting falsified evidence with the intent to defraud Aurora Global Transit? Damian started stammering, his portfolio shaking. No. I was trying to recover the loss. I silenced him with a final, deliberate action. I clicked to the last slide of my presentation. It had no numbers, no logs, only a single table with 3 columns: date, shipment ID, and HS code classification. Before we discuss Mr. Cole's criminal attempts at corporate espionage, I said, my voice cutting through the tension, I want to present something else I found in the deep archival logs of the HelioStream South America division. Logs Mr. Cole probably thought were permanently erased. This is a preliminary report on systematic customs fraud through the deliberate misclassification of high-value leather goods. I believe the fine associated with these actions, if investigated by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, would be closer to $50 million. I had not just neutralized the threat, I had turned the weapon back onto the attacker and prepared for the final, devastating shot. The room was utterly silent, the executives rigid with shock, staring at the projected table detailing Damien's customs fraud. I gave Damien a moment to fully comprehend the depth of his exposure before I continued. During my initial time in South America, working with small, legitimate exporters, I kept hearing whispers, I explained, my voice carrying easily across the table. Rumors about a large American freight company that routinely moved massive quantities of high-value goods out of the region while declaring them as inexpensive, low-tax items. It's the oldest trick in the logistics book, misclassification to dodge tariffs. I clicked to the next slide, splitting the screen into 2 powerful images. On the left was an official customs declaration form from a HelioStream shipment, listing the contents as unfinished rubber accessories, a product with a negligible tariff rate. On the right was a clean, high-resolution photo taken from an internal port log, showing the container being loaded with hundreds of finished luxury leather shoes and jackets, goods subject to high base tariffs and specific regional anti-dumping duties. HelioStream, under the management that had access to these archival logs, systematically misrepresented the Harmonized System, HS, codes for these shipments. I detailed, tapping the screen, by falsely declaring finished leather products as raw rubber or plastic parts, Mr. Cole avoided both the standard import duties and, by crucially, the supplementary anti-dumping tariffs placed on certain finished goods from that specific region. I calculated the total impact for the board. If accurately declared, the company should have been paying standard taxes, plus an additional 28 to 30% in duties on every container. Mr. Cole successfully saved that amount for years, turning tax evasion into a systemic profit center. The potential back taxes, combined with civil and criminal fines for systemic fraud, could easily exceed $50 million, which is why Mr. Cole was so eager to bury these records. Damien was hyperventilating, his eyes darting between me, Marisol, and the closest exit. He tried to speak, but only a choked noise emerged. I had saved the final, most satisfying piece of information for the room itself. I only uncovered this information while legally conducting forensic checks for his frivolous lawsuit against me. I concluded, given the severity of the crime and the need to protect Aurora Global Transit from any association with a company engaged in systemic fraud, I took a preemptive measure. I paused, letting the tension peak, the board members leaning forward in unison. 72 hours ago, before stepping into this room, I filed a confidential, detailed tip, including container numbers, shipment manifests, and the falsified HS codes, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I used an anonymous channel, but the data is irrefutable. As if on cue, timed to the second by the silent efficiency of the world I now commanded, the large glass doors of the boardroom slid open. 2 figures stood there, men in dark, professional suits, carrying official federal identification. "We are with Customs and Border Protection," the lead agent announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "We have a judicial warrant to secure the records and server access pertaining to the South America division of HelioStream Freight, and a summons for Mr. Damien Cole to report for immediate questioning regarding the misclassification of goods. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Damien erupted in a strangled cry. "She's lying! This is a setup! She fabricated it!" He scrambled for his portfolio. His facade of power utterly dissolved into panic. The CBP agents ignored him entirely, their eyes scanning the room only for the identity of their target. As Damien was led away, protesting hysterically that I was a traitor and a thief, he stumbled past the conference table. The raw data logs and the photo of the leather shoes remained projected on the screen, irrefutable evidence against him, provided by the woman he had tried to destroy. The room remained silent for a full minute after the doors closed. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Marisol Drake's pen on the marble table. Finally, she broke the silence, turning to me. "Ms. Morgan, you didn't just defend yourself. You neutralized a $50 million risk to our industry and cleared a competitor that was attempting corporate extortion. You cleaned our path before we even realized we were walking into a minefield." Later that afternoon, in Marisol's private office, she poured 2 small glasses of extremely expensive single malt scotch. "That," Marisol stated, raising her glass to me, "was the finest piece of operational defense and counter-strategy I have witnessed in my 30 years in this business. You are not a director, Lena. You are an executive." The board voted that same day. The resolution was unanimous. I was immediately promoted to Senior Vice President of Global Operations, receiving a salary increase of $50,000 on top of my base and awarded a guaranteed seat on the executive committee. I had gone from an exiled operator to a corporate pillar in the time it took a plane to cross the Atlantic. I stood alone later that evening, looking out from the 48th floor glass wall of my new office. The city below was a glittering, complex grid of light, a colossal logistics problem that I now had the power to influence. I thought about the past. I was once the girl who quietly did the family's expense reports and Excel spreadsheets, the invisible infrastructure holding up lives that never noticed her. Now, I was the one who could call the shots that decided the fate of entire shipping lanes, of entire companies. The revenge wasn't just in Damien's fall or in the money. It was here, in the height and the solitude, in the realization that my capacity for creation and destruction was finally being directed, fully and absolutely, only by me. The week after Damien Cole was escorted out of the Aurora Global Transit boardroom by federal agents, the narrative shifted entirely. Heliostream was engulfed in a crisis, their stock plummeting under the shadow of the CBP investigation. My promotion to Senior Vice President of Global Operations was sealed with a 15% equity stake and the promise of a private jet for my long-haul inspection trips. It was time to close the loop. I sent a single text message to my mother, Carol, using the prepaid number I had not used since I left Lima. The message was simply the name of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants in Tribeca, the kind of place where the hourly electricity cost was more than a middle-class family spent on groceries in a week. The following Saturday, I arrived first. I was wearing a charcoal wool suit, custom-made in London. That felt like armor. I had booked a private dining room, a silent space separated from the main floor by frosted glass, a chamber where the only noise would be the sound of brutal, precise truth. They arrived 10 minutes late. Patrick and Carol looked noticeably older, their faces etched with the stress of the last year and a half. Patrick's tie was slightly askew, and Carol's expensive coat looked tired. Sophia was there, 8 months pregnant, looking perpetually overwhelmed, and Tessa looked hollow. Her usual cascade of designer jewelry was gone, replaced by simple gold studs. The $10,000 from Damien was long gone, spent trying to prop up a lifestyle the family could no longer afford, especially after the IRS started looking into the fallout from Heliostream's collapse and the rapid, low-value sale of their assets. They sat down, and before the waiter could offer a drink, Carol launched into the well-rehearsed accusation. "You know, Lena, we honestly thought you were kidnapped," she began, her voice tight with self-pity. "You leave without a word. The Italy wedding was a fiasco without your help. Sophia had to use a debt collector for a caterer. And the house. We nearly lost the lake house. We sold it at a ridiculous price just to cover the taxes. You were selfish. Lena, you abandoned us when we needed you most. Patrick nodded wearily. We thought you were better than this, sweetheart. We just needed you to handle a few things. Tessa, avoiding my eyes, muttered, I'm still getting debt collection notices. It's not fair. You just disappearing when I had so much going on. I listened, letting the accusations hang in the air. Sipping my sparkling water, they were performing the same routine, convinced that I was still the child who needed to apologize for being an inconvenience. When they finished, I placed a clean, thick manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table. Before we discuss your recent hardships, I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the dramatic atmosphere they had created. Let's talk about one of mine, specifically. May of 2023. I opened the envelope and slid the contents across the table. It was a file marked Case, Morgan, T.V., Real Estate Magnate. Patrick picked up the first page, his eyes widening. It was a police report detailing a near-fatal, drunken driving incident involving Tessa, who had totaled a vintage sports car belonging to a powerful, politically connected real estate mogul. The charges had included driving under the influence and reckless endangerment, potential felonies that would have destroyed her life. You all thought I was just being good with computers and quietly saving money, I continued, my gaze fixed on Tessa, who was now weeping silently. 2 years ago, when Tessa made a choice that could have put her in prison for 3 years, who did she call? Not you. Carol. Not you. Patrick. Me. I leaned forward. I took every single penny of my savings, over $28,000, money I had earmarked for my eventual down payment on a condominium. I used it to hire the best traffic defense lawyer in the state. I paid off the victim for the destruction of his car and his silence. I spent weeks covering every single legal and administrative crack so you wouldn't have to know, so you wouldn't be stressed. I looked at Tessa, who was struggling to formulate a denial. You never apologized. You never offered to repay a cent. You just went back to posting about your new high-end bag, secure in the knowledge that Lena handled it. I let that sink in, the first true glimpse of the unseen burden I had carried for years. Carol and Patrick looked horrified, finally realizing the true cost of my competence. Then, I turned my attention to the most recent betrayal. I placed a printout of Damian Cole's $10,000 cash deposit slip onto the table, dated 3 days after his meeting with Tessa. And then, I said, looking at Tessa again, when a genuine criminal came calling, Damian Cole, looking for any weakness to use against the sister who saved you from prison, you sold me out for a quick $10,000. You gave him the password to the family email, granting him access to all the logs he needed to fabricate his lies. Did you think I wouldn't find out who took the cash? Tessa? Did you think I wouldn't trace the IP that accessed the old files? Tessa's face was wet with tears, but her response was the same pathetic justification. I was broke. My cards were cut. You abandoned us. He said you were a criminal anyway, that he just wanted his money back. I didn't think it would actually hurt you. Lena, you always figure it out. Patrick and Carol looked genuinely devastated, finally understanding that their system was rotten from the inside out, and that their favored daughter had literally compromised the one who kept them solvent. They realized the true extent of the emotional and financial violence they had allowed to thrive in their family. I ignored their attempts at apology. They weren't asking for my forgiveness. They were asking for permission to return to the comfortable lie. I reached for my briefcase and pulled out a final, crisp stack of documents, secured with a thick paperclip. You mentioned the lake house, I said, pushing the papers across the table. The one you panic sold 6 months ago to cover your sudden IRS liabilities, selling it well below market value. Patrick's hands trembled as he read the cover sheet. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. It was a deed of trust and a closing statement. The house has been acquired, I announced, watching their faces. It was purchased by a holding company called Quiet American LLC. The closing price was 20% above the market rate you desperately took, ensuring a clean, rapid sale for you. I paused. That company is mine. I bought the lake house, the one you always claimed was the heart of the Morgan family, and I now hold the absolute title. I reached into my pocket and placed a single item on the table. A new set of keys, engraved with the address of the Vermont Lake House. You are all welcome to use the lake house for family gatherings, I stated, defining the terms clearly. It will remain a place for you to meet and connect, because I am not cruel, but all decisions, all maintenance, all access, and all usage policies belong to me. You are guests in the space I own. I looked pointedly at Tessa. And you, Tessa, are forbidden from stepping foot on the property until you have fully reimbursed me for the $28,000 in legal fees, the $10,000 you took from a corporate fraudster, plus 6% interest on the entire amount. You can start by getting a real job. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my suit. I didn't wait for a response, didn't wait for a tearful plea, or for the words of contrition that would never truly come. I dropped a credit card onto the table to cover the entire cost of the extravagant, untouched meal. I had done what I came to do. I didn't need their apology to heal. I needed their reality to shift. I needed them to understand, irrevocably, that the system was closed, the engine was gone, and the only person with power in the room was me. As I walked out of the glass private room, leaving the four Morgans silently staring at the house keys, the symbol of their lost power and my new dominion, I stepped out onto the busy Manhattan street. My phone immediately buzzed. It was Marisol Drake. "Lena, I'm sending over the final drafts for the Asia-Pacific expansion," she said, her voice brisk and demanding. "We need you in Singapore by Tuesday. Can you handle the logistics?" "Consider it done, Marisol," I replied, stepping into the sleek black car waiting at the curb. My life, now entirely my own, continued its forward, relentless momentum. The family, if they ever wanted a place in it, would have to learn, for the first time in their lives, how to finally handle themselves. Thank you so much for tuning in to the final part of Lena's story. I'd love to hear what you think of this kind of long game revenge. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what you're thinking right now. Please like this video and subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories. And hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.